Europe is full of magnificent cathedrals. If you've been there, you've seen it. Well, in fact, you've probably seen some of them, even if you haven't been there. You're looking at one right there. That's in Milan. That's in Cologne, Germany. You may have seen the pictures of this one. At the end of the Second World War, the Allies completely destroyed Cologne with their bombing. But the cathedral itself was almost completely untouched. It was just rubble everywhere except for that magnificent building. These magnificent buildings are all over Europe. Huge, beautiful monuments to Christianity. Europe has a ton of them. What Europe doesn't have is very many Christians. These magnificent cathedrals today are largely museums. It's a place for tourists to go, not worshipers. It's a reminder that once upon a time, Christianity was at the center of European civilization, even though today it doesn't really have much of a place at all. It's a historical relic. The United States is not there.
No.
Not yet. But I think we know that America is changing. And we know that increasingly Christianity is becoming less and less prominent, that fewer and fewer people claim to be Christians. You can see that graph on the left, not very well because it's small. And if I'm having trouble seeing it from here, I know you guys are having trouble seeing it from there. The number falls every single year. It's not just Christianity, though. The truth is, church membership, whether it's a church, a synagogue, or a mosque, has been falling dramatically as well, year after year, for a very long time. Just recently, it fell below 50% for the first time. We live in a country that is no longer as religious or as Christian as it once was. Now, there are lots of explanations for this. Some people talk about how, well, it's the younger generations. They were raised differently. They were born into a different world. They have all of these entertainment options. They have all of these other ways of connecting with people or faux connecting with people through the internet, and therefore the church isn't as important. Another explanation is the demographics have changed. You have more and more people who did not grow up in a Christian country, didn't grow up in the church, who have moved to this place, and so of course, fewer and fewer Americans identify as Christians. I think all of those explanations are potentially true, and there are some others as well. I'm going to offer another one for you today that I want you to think about. What if, at least in part, it's us? What if the world sees us? What if the world knows us? What if the world says, I know the people who sit inside that building. I see them Monday through Friday, and I don't want what they're offering.
Yeah. That's right.
I'm a substitute teacher. I am not the pastor of this church, as you well know. I'm not the pastor of any church. Now, the problem with being a substitute teacher, as all of you know because we all had them, at least at one point in our lives, is that there is a very real possibility that the substitute teacher doesn't know what he's talking about. And I'm going to say right now that I'm leaving the door open to that possibility this morning, okay?
Okay.
The first part of what I have to say, I think, is relatively easy. I think we're all going to be in agreement, and we're all going to feel really good about it. The second part, I got to be honest. I don't know. I just don't know, okay?
Mm-hmm.
But I am not the Pope, and I do not claim to be infallible. So here's what I'm going to promise you today. I'm going to raise some questions that I think the church needs to be asking. And I'm going to answer those questions as best I can, trying to use scripture and good logic. I'm going to try, okay? I make no promises. I'm going to try. If at the end of that, some of what I have to say you think is nonsense, I apologize and I can live with that. I can still love you and we can still be friends. Deal?
Deal?
Okay. We're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 today. It's going to be up on the screen. You can turn there if you want. You don't have to. Before we start to read it, I want to talk a little bit about ancient Corinth, because I think there are some things about Corinth that make this story make a little bit more sense. In Paul's day, Corinth, which of course is in Greece, Corinth was a relatively new city, only about 100 years, because the Romans in 146 BC had completely destroyed the place. They had knocked it all down. The people there were dead, became slaves, or ran away somewhere else where there were still buildings, okay? It was gone. And then 100 years after that, Julius Caesar then founded a new city of Corinth. And he settled a whole bunch of Romans there. And it became a very important administrative center for the Romans. The Romans, of course, controlled all of the Mediterranean, including all of Greece. It became an important administrative center, a very important city. It was on a critical trade route, and it was extraordinarily rich because of the trade and because the Romans poured money into it. It was very important. It was very diverse, and it was very cosmopolitan. Corinth was not like a town in, say, Galilee. Corinth was a very different kind of place with very different types of people. There were Romans, there were Greeks, there were Jews, there were other traders from all over the Mediterranean basin in this place. Okay, that's what Corinth was like.
New York.
It's funny you say that. Yes, like New York, or like San Francisco, or like other places in modern America where you gather lots of different people from lots of different places who have lots of different values, who are wealthy and sophisticated and cosmopolitan and maybe a little bit too smart for some of what we believe, right? That's the way people see it. This is what Corinth was like. And this is important because what we see going on in Corinth can partially be explained by what that city was like. All right. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 1. Here we go. I was going to read this, but it occurred to me that I don't have my reading glasses, which I actually need now, which is sort of disappointing. This happened to me about a year ago. I'm actually in the middle of a trial, and I pick up, first time in my life, I pick up an exhibit, and I try to read from the exhibit, and I can't read a single word, not one. Not one. And that very day, I have to run to Walmart and pick up a cheap pair of over-the-counter reading glasses. I don't have those. I'm going to look at this screen. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 1. It is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you. And sexual immorality of such a kind that does not exist even among the Gentiles. Namely, that someone has his father's wife. You have become arrogant and have not mourned instead, so that the one who had done this deed would be removed from your midst. Well, that ain't good. Right? Can we agree on that? That ain't good. See, I told you the first part of this would be easy. We're all in agreement. That's not good. Paul says, what in the world is going on with you guys? Not even the Gentiles put up with that kind of nonsense. When Paul says not even the Gentiles would be into that, this is not a compliment. He is saying, look, those people are messed up. And even those messed up people, they're not good with that. But you guys are. You're arrogant about it. You see it, you know about it, you accept it, you're okay with it. You brag about how open-minded and tolerant you are. And Paul's upset. It is possible for things to be going on inside the church that are so unacceptable that it actually would bother the people outside the church. Doesn't that happen? Isn't it possible? When Paul says, not even the Gentiles will put up with that. What do we take that to mean? I take that to mean there are people outside that church in the city of Corinth who know what's going on in there and are disgusted by it. And they're probably telling themselves, those people are weird. I don't want to have anything to do with those people. Look at the kind of stuff they're into, right?
That's right.
They're disgusted by it. They don't want to be a part of the church because they see what's going on and they say, yuck, I don't want any of that.
That's right.
That happens today, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
In fact, it happened just this week. After years of sweeping things under the rug and covering them up and trying to avoid them, just this week, an independent report was issued about what's going on in the Southern Baptist Convention for many, many years. Have you guys seen this yet?
No.
For a very long time, the Southern Baptist Convention, the executive committee, the people who run the convention on a daily basis, has been receiving reports that pastors and staff members and other church leaders all across the country were engaged in sexual assaults, sexual molestations, and the like, and that consistently these things were swept under the rug. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of examples. That's what the report details. Hundreds of them. And all the time, some of the highest ranking, most important people in the Southern Baptist Convention hid it. And they continued to try to hide it even after it was raised at the convention on the floor. They still tried to hide it, and they still tried to find somebody to do a paper over it sort of investigation so that all the ugliness wouldn't come out. That happened. And the world knows it happened because that report came out and it was everywhere. CNN, the New York Times, everywhere. Okay? It is still possible today for things to happen in the church that people outside the church hear about and say, I don't want to have anything to do with those people over there. Everything I thought I knew about them was right. It happens. Look, the Catholic Church still hasn't bounced back from the years of horrific abuse and cover-ups in that organization, right? We know that. They've never recovered from that. And all the while that we know this about the Catholic Church, major Southern Baptist Convention officials know about the same thing in Southern Baptist churches and cover it up. Now, if that was all Paul had to say in the first part of 1 Corinthians chapter 5, I'd end this sermon early. We'd all go home. We'd be disgusted by what was going on, but we would also be able to say, but I didn't do it. And yes, the people that were involved, the General Council of the Southern Baptist Convention, members of the Executive Committee of the Southern Baptist Convention, multiple presidents of the Southern Baptist Convention who knew at least some of these and covered them up. We can blame them. We could also say, because there was one former president of the Southern Baptist Convention who was credibly accused of sexually assaulting another pastor's wife. That's one of the big allegations in this. And you know what happened to him? Nothing. Continued to pastor, and when he resigned, he went to work for the convention, and that's where he's been for some years, until this week, when it was disclosed. Now, if that's all that we had to talk about, we'd feel a little gross inside, but at least we could say, at least we didn't do it. But Paul has more to say in the chapter. And I gotta tell you, this is where it's gonna get harder, okay? This is where you're gonna wish you didn't have a substitute teacher. Maybe not, we'll see. I don't know. I don't know how it's gonna go. But the good news about being a substitute is that when you're done with the substitute teaching gig, you move on with your life. And so if that happens, that happens. We're going back to 1 Corinthians chapter 5. We're gonna pick up this time in verse 9. Paul writes, I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. I did not at all mean with the sexually immoral people of this world, or with the greedy and swindlers, or with idolaters, for then you would have to leave the world. But actually, I wrote to you not to associate with any so-called brother, if he is a sexually immoral person, or a greedy person, or an idolater, or is verbally abusive, or habitually drunk, or a swindler, not even to eat with such a person. For what business of mine is it to judge outsiders? Do you not judge those who were within the church? But those who are outside God judges. Remove the evil person from among yourselves. Okay. Now, let's start by agreeing that all of us are sinners. Yes? All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. We know that. All of us need God's grace. None of us have earned God's favor, and none of us can claim that we're perfect. Paul's not saying that we're called to be perfect. It's not what he's saying. What he is saying is that there are some behaviors that are so destructive of the church, so destructive of what we're about, that the church should not tolerate those things. Do we agree with this?
Yes.
Does the church tolerate these things?
Sure.
Many of you have been in the church for a very long time. I don't mean to insult you with that. I just know it to be a fact. Many of you have been in the church for a very long time. So have I. Maybe not as long as some of you, but I grew up in the church and I'm almost 50. I've been in the church for a long time. I've seen what goes on in the church. What are we willing to tolerate inside the church? Do we tolerate dishonesty? Listen, how many times in churches all around this country do you have deacons or Sunday school teachers or staff members who Monday through Friday are in the business world lying to their boss, lying to their customers, cheating and being dishonest, and then they come to church on Sunday? Does it happen? Look, we know it happens, right? We know this happens. In fact, in most churches, a lot of the people can name those people. They know who they are. This happens all the time, all over the place. Gossip. Do we have a gossip problem in churches? Do we have a problem with people gossiping and slandering and stabbing other church members in the back? Do we have that problem in the church?
Yes.
In congregation after congregation, from sea to shining sea, we have that problem, don't we? We know this happens. Factions and backstabbing, selfishness and greed, people out to get what they want, people out to impose their views on everybody else. And we fight and we fight and we fight. And we tolerate it in the church, don't we?
Yes.
Listen, there's a reason why there's so many people outside the church who say, I ain't going in there.
Yeah.
Part of that reason is because they know who is in there. This is on us to carry. When we talk about why it is that so many people no longer want to be a part of the church, so many people no longer want to claim to be Christians, part of the blame for that is us. Part of the blame for that is that the world, it's not that the world doesn't know us, it's that the world does. Part of what Paul is saying is, I told you to clean up your behavior inside that place, okay? And we don't very well. We don't. And that turns off the world. But here's the thing. You know what? We make it worse. Because that's not all we do. We act the way we act, and we do it with arrogance because we then turn around and condemn the world for the way they behave. Don't we? And here's what's amazing about it. Do you remember the last few sentences that we read in chapter 5? Paul said, for what business of mine is it to judge outsiders? Do you not judge those who are within the church? But those who are outside, God judges.
That's right.
It's not the church's job to judge the behavior of those not inside the church. Oh boy. I think that many of our churches didn't get that memo because we spend a whole lot of time talking about the behavior of those outside the church. And look, it's one thing if we were to do that in love and if we were clean ourselves. But geez, when we have the sort of fighting and gossip and backstabbing and dishonesty and the sort of stuff that goes on in churches all over the country, and then we turn around and we point the finger at those outside the church and say, look at you guys, you're all messed up.
Yeah.
We don't really have to ask ourselves today, why is it that so many people outside the church say, I'm not sure I want to go in there? Do we? Doesn't it at least make a little bit of sense?
Yeah.
I'll be honest, as someone who's grown up in the church and who, because of who my dad was, sort of knows about the things that go on behind the scenes, the things that people don't know if you just casually show up on Sundays, especially to a bigger church.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not at all astounded that less than 50% of the population is a member of the church. I sometimes wonder how we got almost 50. Okay? We have, because we're sinful human beings, we have certain temptations to behave in ways that we shouldn't. We know that. I'm not perfect. Don't claim to be. I mess up all the time. Probably will again today at some point. Don't want to. And we have a particular problem now. We have a particular temptation now. This is where it's going to get difficult. I'm telling you, it's going to get difficult now, okay? If I keep telling you that, you'll believe me. You won't be surprised and you won't be as angry. We're living in a strange time. Aren't we living in a strange time now? I mean, the world got weird. And it got weird in a hurry. And the sorts of things that we had, I thought, all sort of shared in common. I mean, Americans have always had different opinions and different political parties and different views and whatever. But there were certain things that by and large we all seem to agree about. And now we don't at all. And things have gotten crazy. And I'll be honest, it bothers me a little bit. And I fear for the future of my country more than a little bit. And I suspect that many of you do too.
Yes.
I want to talk about what we're seeing because I think what we're seeing is something that we need to learn from and we need to be very careful of becoming ourselves. Okay? Where does this come from? I think most of you probably have seen on the internet or the television stations when we had the riots going on, when we had the protests going on, some of which were peaceful, some of which were mostly peaceful, some of which were not peaceful at all. And I think you know what I'm talking about. And in some cases, they were outright confrontational, right? People just trying to eat dinner on a sidewalk cafe, being screamed at and harassed, right? You saw this. It was ugly, and it was painful to watch. And you look at it and you say, what is wrong with people? What country do we live in? The world is changing so that it's not really recognizable anymore. There was a time when just about everybody in America agreed on a few basic things, such as that America is largely a source of good in the world, right? For a long time, just about everybody shared that perspective.
Yeah.
We shared the perspective that there were certain things that we're about that are very important to us, like civil liberties such as free speech. It's
Yes.
very important to us, right?
Very
And it was important to everybody. And Democrats and Republicans may have focused on different civil liberties, but they were both focused on the civil liberties they cared about. And by and large, all bought into this idea that our system is a good one, that our country is a good one, that our Constitution and the rights in it are good ones. And now it's not at all clear that everybody shares that perspective anymore. And if some of you are like me, it might worry you a little bit. There was a time when those who were disappointed with America, and let's be honest, America has always given plenty of reason to be disappointed, right? We have always fallen short of our ideals to some extent. But there was a time when the people who were upset about that would claim the promise of America. They would simply say, I want to claim the ideals of America. I want us to live up to those ideals, right? This is Frederick Douglass or Martin Luther King Jr. or others, this is the approach. As opposed to, this whole thing is rotten and we need to tear it all down. Here's what I want you to understand. This should be familiar to us, because I'm going to argue now, and I may be wrong, and if I'm wrong, you can ignore me. But I'm going to argue now that this is Christianity without Christ. This philosophy is Christianity without Christ. And if that's true, we need to learn from it. What is it that the protesters that scare us more than a little bit were saying? That the world, this society is systematically broken, right? You heard it. Systemic racism.
Always something wrong.
But by the way, doesn't that sound at least a little bit like traditional Christian doctrine? Don't we believe that this is a fallen world that's fundamentally broken, that sin has so infused this world, every crack of it, that it has to be redeemed? It's fundamentally broken and has to be redeemed. Isn't that traditional Christian doctrine?
Yes.
Some similarities there at least, right? Some similarities. That this is fundamentally a world of sin. They don't use the word sin. It's racism, sexism, other isms.
Murder.
But they're saying the same thing. That all of us are tainted by that sin. That's the argument, right? That every single one of you is a racist. Whether you want to be or not, that's what you are. Whether you know it or not, that's what you are. That's the contention that they make when they're screaming at people on the street. Don't we agree that all of us are tainted by sin? We're all sinners and fall short of the glory of God. We all believe that.
Yeah.
So again, there's at least a similarity there, isn't it? That we can't be okay with the current status of things. We must repent. Silence is violence. If you simply continue to go along, you're in the wrong, right? Isn't this what the protesters were screaming at us?
Yes.
Don't we believe that, in fact, it's not okay to be satisfied with this sinful state, and we do, in fact, have to repent? That's not all that different. And that we need to take action to help the oppressed. But Jesus talked a whole lot about helping those who need help. The sick, the hungry, the poor, right?
That's right.
Again, there are similarities here. What's the primary difference between what the protesters who scare us, if we're going to be honest with ourselves, are saying, and what Christians have been saying for a very long time? The difference is, what they're preaching is Christianity without Christ. There's no redemption. There's no grace. It's just fighting forever. That's what they're offering. They're offering fighting forever, conflict forever, because there is no redemption and no grace. Now, this is why I bring this up. Because if I'm right, and if what we're seeing, if this movement that bothers so many in this room so much, if that movement is in fact Christianity without Christ, then we need to be very, very careful about what we're doing in our churches. Because Christianity without Christ is an ugly, dangerous thing. Now, Christianity without Christ. An absolute certainty about things that can't be empirically proven. But again, you say this country is built on racism. There is systemic racism, right? Okay, you can't prove that in a lab, right? I can't get a beaker and run some experiments and come out with that. But neither can I run experiments that would prove that all of us have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. These are articles of faith. And for the believers, they're articles of faith that need to be accepted. Okay? No space for dissent or reasonable difference of opinion. A focus on finding and removing the dissenters and heretics, what we call today in the news, cancellation, right? You said the wrong thing, I'll erase you.
Yes.
Like this is what Stalin did forever, right? You'd have these pictures of all the major communists, and then 10 years later you'd start erasing faces out of them because those people never existed. We canceled them.
Yeah.
But you know what? This way of looking at the world, there are churches that do this. I'm going to give you an example. You know who these guys are?
True like to pray.
You ever hear of Westboro Baptist Church? You ever hear of them? I wish that nobody ever would have heard of Westboro Baptist Church, but sadly I have. Westboro Baptist Church is Christianity without Christ. It's Christianity without grace, without redemption. Okay? Look at it. What are they saying? Thank God for 9/11. It's fantastic that terrorists killed over 2,000 people. Thank God for that. Look at some of these other signs. God hates America. God hates facts. You bothered by my language? It's their language. And they're saying it. They're saying it in the name of our cause to the whole world. And they do everything they can to get on television so that the whole world sees what they have to say. And they do that nonsense and even claim to be Baptists. Gosh, I wish they didn't have that. I wish it was Westboro Methodist Church, something. Westboro Presbyterian, please. Please use a different name, but they don't. This is what Christianity without Christ looks like. And while these two groups of people hate each other and think they're opposites, I look at the two of them and I say, actually, they look like the same people to me. The same mindset, the same approach, the same ugliness. They look the same to me. Now, why do I say all this? Is it because I think this church or most other churches are like Westboro Baptist Church? Nope.
No.
Do I think that we are promoting Christianity without Christ?
No.
Nope. But here's what I do think. I think that we have certain temptations today because of the world that we live in. And we need to be very careful how we deal with those temptations. We are always impacted by the world around us. We can't help but be. This is true of individuals, it's true of the church. And different types of churches respond in different ways. Now we know, a lot of us probably don't like it, but we all know it, that these days, just about the entire culture is dominated by a particular political philosophy, right? The progressives run everything, and we know that. The media, the universities, the movies, music, they run the social media companies increasingly. They run all the big companies, right? They do. We know this. What this means is that the mainline Protestant denominations, who tend to be far more liberal, they simply join in with the culture around them. Whatever the New York Times happens to be promoting at that particular point in time is what the mainline Protestant denominations happen to be promoting at that particular time. That's the reality. That's the reality. And in the process, they make it where they don't have a message that is distinct from the world and they don't have a place of relevance. Because why would you be interested in going to the mainline Protestant church and hearing somebody say the same thing that you could see on CNN from somebody who's probably better looking and more articulate and probably has better graphics and all the rest, right?
Yeah.
Why do I need you when I have Lady Gaga, right? I mean, why do I need you? You're saying the same stuff, you're just not as good at saying it. I'll stay home. And they have made themselves irrelevant, and they're in the process of becoming extinct. That's what's happening with most of the more liberal Christian denominations, okay?
Yeah.
Now, if I were talking to a group of Methodists in San Francisco, I'd probably spend a lot of time talking about that. We're not in San Francisco, We're in small town Texas, and this is a Southern Baptist church, so I'm not sure that talking about how liberals deal with the world around them is really going to be an important topic in this place.
No.
So, let's talk about what the conservative church does. Because I'm guessing, never been in the voting booth with any of you, but I'm guessing that there's probably a whole lot more of that in this place than there is MSNBC watching progressives, okay? Let's talk about it. Because I think, if we're not careful, we're tempted with some things that are going to destroy us. I believe that. What is it that the conservative church is tempted to do in this world? We are tempted to purge and to fight. Now, what do I mean by that? These same Southern Baptist leaders, many of these same Southern Baptist leaders, who we could not count on to stand up and fight against sexual abuse in the church, have spent the better part of 4 decades fighting about all kinds of other things, haven't they?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, look, if any of you have spent time in the world of Southern Baptists, you know that for the better part of the last 40 years, there has been near constant fighting in our denomination about a great many things. And that's led to splintering, it's led to people leaving, it's been led to people being kicked out, it's been led to a lot of fighting. Both sides thought they were doing God's work. Both sides thought they were fighting for the soul of this convention and for the soul of America, and I genuinely think they all believed it. But the simple fact of the matter is that Southern Baptist leaders who couldn't stand up against sexual assault stood up against a whole bunch of other things for a very long time and fought about it for a very long time. Sexual assault, not interested in dealing with that. Speaking in tongues, oh yeah, I'll weigh in on that. The role of women in ministry, I can't wait to let my views be heard on that.
Oh, yes. And they do.
And look, here's the thing. Some of these issues are really hard. I'll be honest with you. I'm not a tongue speaker. Not. I've never done it. And if I'm going to be really honest, it feels a little bit weird. Okay? I'm not insulting anybody here who speaks in tongues. It feels a little bit weird to me. I've never done it. At the same time, I've read the New Testament. I mean, it's in there.
It's in there.
It's in there. Paul calls it a spiritual gift. So, look, I don't know what to do with that, people. I don't know. It's above my pay grade. What I do know is that the issue that we were fighting about, the issue that we were spending so long lobbing accusations back and forth over, is one that actually isn't resolved very clearly by this book. It can't be. Because when the Southern Baptist Convention was saying we're not going to support missionaries who speak in tongues, they were saying it was because that gift disappeared after the early church days. Which is fine. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. I'm not offering an opinion. What I am saying is that if it came after the early church days, it's not in here. And that means that we've made some sort of leap of faith or logic where we've concluded this is the right doctrine. And maybe it is. But here's what I'm saying. That actually strikes me as, one, something that could give rise to a difference of opinion, and two, can't be conclusively decided by the book that we all claim as Southern Baptists is the book that determines what's right and what's wrong for us, right?
Right.
But we thought about that for a very long time. And if we're going to be honest, Southern Baptists have a history of making all kinds of conclusions that can't be resolved
That's another one.
by the Bible.
The Holy Spirit is not another one.
I'm not going to encourage anybody to go out and have a glass of wine tonight, but you know what? The Bible does not say you can't. It does not. You know what the ancient Jews did? They drank wine. And I hate to be the first one to point that out in this assembly, but it's there.
Yes.
I've read it. It's there. Which is why this idea that you must abstain from alcohol is a relatively new phenomenon invented by American Christians in the 19th century. Look it up. The rest of the world has no idea what we're talking about.
No, they don't.
Christianity before the 19th century, I have no idea what we're talking about. You say what? It doesn't make any sense. Now, I'm not telling you to drink alcohol. I think you could make the strong argument that drinking alcohol is a bad thing. And those people that decide, I'm going to stay away from a substance that has destroyed many lives, more power to you. I'm fine with it. My point is different. My point is that we have a tendency to create rules about things that are not clearly stated in this book, and then we fight about those. And we purge the people who disagree with us. And we fight, and we fight, and we fight, and we fight. And look, a church that is so busy fighting over stuff that the Bible doesn't even conclusively say one side or the other is right on, is a church that's probably too distracted to do its job, number one, and is probably a church that the rest of the world looks at and says, yeah, no thanks. I don't want to be a part of those guys. And they're not crazy to feel that way, are they?
No.
That strikes me as somewhat reasonable to look at us fighting over these things and decide I want to be a part of it. So, what am I telling you? A little bit of humility might be in order. We don't know nearly as much as we think we do. We don't. The older I get, the more I realize how many things that I once felt really comfortable with that all of a sudden I look at now and say, I don't know anymore. It's hard. And why wouldn't it be hard? Our capacity to understand God's things has to be somewhat limited, doesn't it? We're not Him. How can we possibly understand all that God understands? Our capacity is limited. We understand a small sliver of the truth, a small sliver that He's given to us. And because of who we are, we probably mess up most of that. Paul wrote an entire book to the Galatians talking about not being captured by legalism. He wrote multiple chapters in Romans and to the Corinthians where he talks about how we're going to have differences of opinion in the church on some pretty big and weighty issues, and it's okay. Didn't he?
Yep.
A little bit of humility is in order. We don't know nearly as much as we think we do. In fact, even the giants of the faith were so often wrong about so many things. There were some godly people in Jesus' day who did not recognize Him as the Messiah. Why? Because they expected the Messiah to be different. They didn't understand. The disciples spend years with Jesus. He explains to them over and over again what's going to happen. They still don't get it. And by the way, I know we like to tease them and make fun of them, but the idea that somehow we're in a position of superiority over Peter and James and John is a little bit silly, don't you think? Yeah. We would have been just as confused as them. The reality is, we need to be very careful about fighting amongst ourselves over things that we probably don't fully understand anyway. I mean, there's some things that we should all be able to agree on. Jesus Christ is the Son of God. He's the way to salvation. There's some things we should be able to agree on, but boy, the list of things we fight about is a whole lot bigger than that list of things that we should all be able to agree on. That's the reality.
Yep.
And sometimes I expect God to come down and tell us what He told to Job. Remember what happened with Job? I mean, Job had to put up with these friends of his. Bad friends, maybe bad friends, but they did sit with him for days. I mean, I've never sat with a friend of mine for days when he was going through a tough time, so they're probably better friends than me. But these friends of his are telling Job what? It's got to be your fault. God doesn't do this to somebody who hasn't sinned. Repent, and maybe He'll give you your stuff back. Maybe you won't have those sores anymore, right? Maybe you'll have some money in the bank. And Job eventually gets frustrated with this, and what does Job say? He says, I want an explanation for God. You guys are wrong. I want an explanation for God. And all of a sudden, he got it. And what did God say? He said, where were you, Job, when I laid the foundation of the earth? You're so smart. Were you around when I built this place? Do you know how it works? Do you know how I did it? Answer some questions. You want a discussion? Let's have a discussion. I'm going to ask you some questions and put you in your place. And I sometimes wonder if the modern church isn't going to have God appear and say, where were you, people? Fighting amongst yourself about all kinds of things, causing havoc in the church. That's problem number one. A little bit of humility is probably in order. Number two, I'm going to get myself in trouble. This is my last point, so I'm going to get myself in trouble and then I'm going to run right out that door. You ready? Remember what our role is. We are not at war with the world. These days, much of the evangelical world is, in fact, at war with the world. And we do it in a lot of different ways, in part by essentially turning some of our biggest, most important churches into political rallies and political parties. We do. You guys have seen it. I've seen it. I've seen some of the biggest, most important churches with some of the biggest, most important pastors standing on the same stage with politicians, talking about who people should vote for, and talking about how God sent us this particular politician, whoever it may be. This is God's man doing God's work. Okay. Here's the thing about politics, though. Politics almost always involves compromising your principles in order to get 51% of the vote. Doesn't it?
Yeah.
And we know this. Everybody talks about how politicians are liars. And why do we talk about how politicians are liars? Because politicians are liars. That's why. There's a certain amount of compromising of your principles that you have to do in order to get 51% of the vote, and the people who are most successful do it very, very well. It doesn't mean that they're all bad people. I'm not saying that.
No.
I'm saying that's the nature of politics. And you know what else the nature of politics is? Politics is about winning. It's about defeating your opponent. It's about making sure that you win. Here's my problem, though. If the church is essentially an arm of a political party, if our primary goal is to win, to defeat our enemies, to make sure that we get 51% of the vote, and we're willing to compromise however we must in order to achieve that goal, I don't think we can do what we're supposed to be doing. I don't know how you reach a world with the gospel when you're fighting with that world. I don't know how you persuade somebody that God is love if you're busy screaming at them and punching them in the face. Am I wrong about this? And let's be honest about something. Much of the Christian evangelical conservative movement is up to here in compromise today. I wasn't very old in the 90s, but I was there, and I remember what our church leaders said about Bill Clinton and his behavior, and why it's important for our political leaders to be morally upstanding, to tell the truth. And I thought they believed it. I don't think they believe it anymore.
No.
Because much of that goes out the window when it's time for us to win. And why do we feel that way? Because we're scared for our country, we're scared for what's happening around us, and so we decide we're going to fight and we're going to win, and we make that our focus. But if our focus is fighting and winning, our focus is not on God's things. And I want you to back up just for a second, because I want to remind you what Christianity without Christ looks like. Because if we take our eyes off of Christ, we run the risk that we will be promoting Christianity without Christ. Amen. And it's ugly. Now, what do we do with all this? I'm not telling you who to vote for. I'm not telling you whether you should vote. I'm not telling you what political positions you should have. It's not my business. I am saying this. The church is not a political party, and we are not a political movement. We are God's people, and our job is to promote God's good news.
Yes.
And you know what? You can't do that by fighting with people and calling them names. You can't. Is that what Jesus did? Jesus was criticized because he would not do those things. Look, listen, Matthew chapter 9. Then it happened that as Jesus was reclining at the table in the house, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and began dining with Jesus and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why is your teacher eating with the tax collectors and sinners?" But when Jesus heard this, he said, "It is not those who are healthy who need a physician, but those who are sick. Now go and learn what this means. I desire compassion rather than sacrifice.
Yes.
For I did not come to call the righteous but sinners. Ladies and gentlemen, our job is not to defeat our political opponents. Our job is not to own the libs in modern speak. That is not who we are. And if that's your focus, I wish you the best of luck. You may even accomplish some things politically that I'd like to see accomplished, maybe. But at the expense of being the people that you were called to be. That is not who we're supposed to be. And right now, the church faces a temptation because of what's going on around us to compromise ourselves and fight instead of doing what Jesus did, which is to try to actually form relationships with the people of the world, to understand them, to love them, and to share the good news. I don't think we can do both. It's time for us to decide which one we want to do. All right, let's pray.